The conflict in Ukraine isn't just a war over land, it's a complex mind game between global superpowers. This fight isn't only happening on the battlefield, it's spreading into economics, politics, and the military, with big consequences for the whole world. The big question is, who will win this standoff and how much will it cost everyone involved? This long war has put a lot of pressure on NATO, Russia, and other countries involved. For NATO, especially European countries, their unity, which is their strength, is being tested by economic problems. Since the war started, energy prices in Europe have skyrocketed, putting big economies like Germany, France, and Italy in a tough spot. Rising inflation, climbing prices, and broken supply chains are making life harder for Europeans. These problems are causing protests, from small strikes to big demonstrations. These events make people wonder, can NATO keep supporting Ukraine when they're facing instability at home? US policy plays a big role in keeping NATO united. Since the war began, the US has led efforts to give military and financial aid to Ukraine. However, the US approach has downsides too. The US president, especially if Donald Trump returns to power, might force European allies to give more money to NATO. This means European countries, already struggling because of the economic crisis, would have to take on more responsibility to keep the alliance's military strong. Some countries might agree, but others will feel too much pressure, which could cause division within NATO. Meanwhile, Russia, despite economic sanctions from the West, has shown it's tough. The Russian government quickly shifted its economy to a wartime state, focusing on self-reliance and using its own resources. Russia has shown it can keep its energy surplus and food security even when it's isolated from international markets. Energy, one of Russia's strategic weapons, is still important. Russia not only meets its own needs, but also exports to big markets like China and India, making a lot of money to keep its war machine going. Besides energy, Russia has also made big strides in its defense industry. Mastering advanced weapons technology has helped Russia not only supply itself, but also increase arms exports to countries not involved in the sanctions. These advances let Russia keep using its strategy of wearing down its enemies, dragging out the war to weaken both NATO and Ukraine. Russia seems to believe that if Europe's economy and society get bad enough, internal pressure will force these countries to negotiate with Moscow, making concessions to find peace. However, we can't forget the US, the main coordinator in this conflict. While Europe and Russia are caught in the war, the US seems to be safely on the sidelines. Not only that, but the US is also benefiting from the conflict in many ways. First, the US has become the top supplier of liquefied natural gas to Europe, filling the gap left by Russia. This not only brings huge profits to the US energy industry, but also strengthens America's position as a global energy power. Second, US defense contractors are also benefiting greatly from the increased demand for weapons in Europe and Ukraine. From guided missiles to drones, the US is providing the most advanced military technology to support its allies while making huge profits. Besides, the US dollar's position in the global financial system is also strengthened, as the crisis in Europe increases demand for this currency. However, the benefits the US gains don't mean everyone benefits. Europe, directly affected by the war, is suffering heavy losses. The European economy is not only facing a recession, but is also losing its ability to compete with the US and China in the global market. These difficulties are forcing many EU countries to rethink their strategies, especially their policies towards Russia. Some Eastern European countries like Poland or the Baltic states may want to continue a tough stance against Moscow, but large countries like Germany and France may seek a more neutral solution to protect their economic interests. The future of the EU and NATO will depend a lot on how member states handle internal challenges. If they can't overcome differences in interests, the EU risks being divided and NATO could lose its unity. This would be a big win for Russia because it weakens their main opponent in this war. So who will win this conflict? Russia, with its self-reliant and persistent strategy, can sustain the war for many years, but they also face international pressure and the risk of long-term exhaustion. The US, despite benefiting greatly from the war, cannot avoid negative impacts if the conflict lasts too long and gets out of control. And Europe, the biggest loser, will have to find a way to adjust its strategy to avoid a prolonged crisis. The final answer will depend on how the parties involved shape their strategies in the coming years. Ukraine, the center of the global conflict between Russia and NATO, is the country suffering the most in this endless war. Under President Volodymyr Zelensky's leadership, this country has become a battlefield of sorrow where millions of people bear terrible consequences. When the war broke out, Ukraine entered the fight with the spirit of protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But in reality, the war quickly turned into a proxy confrontation between Russia and NATO. Ukraine, instead of being a main player, has become a pawn on the global geopolitical chessboard. Ukraine's losses are not limited to people or territory, but also weigh heavily on the future of an entire nation. On the battlefield, Ukraine has sacrificed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to hold every inch of land. Thousands of civilians have also been killed in fierce fighting, and these numbers continue to rise every day. Cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut are almost completely destroyed, with millions of people losing their homes and having to flee abroad. More than 8 million people have left their homeland, creating an unprecedented refugee crisis since World War II. Those who stayed face a harsh winter, living with shortages of electricity, water, and basic food. Ukraine, once a developing country with much potential, has become a symbol of destruction. Under Zelensky's leadership, Ukraine has received strong support from NATO and Western countries. However, complete dependence on foreign aid has left the Ukrainian government unable to control its own fate. Zelensky, despite his great efforts to attract aid, is criticized for not having a clear strategy to reduce the damage to his country. Huge military aid packages from the US and Europe have helped Ukraine prolong the war, but they're not enough for a decisive victory. Modern weapons like HIMARS, Patriot or Leopard are sent to the battlefield, but they don't change the fact that Russia still has the upper hand on many fronts. Instead of winning, Ukraine is caught in a war of attrition, where every day that passes is another day the country is drained. However, the problem is not only on the battlefield. Ukraine's economy has collapsed, with GDP falling more than 30% since the war began. Many key industries are completely destroyed, while the government has to borrow money to keep operating. Corruption, a long-standing problem, has become even more serious as Western aid is lost or poorly managed. The Ukrainian people, once strongly supportive of the government, are now gradually losing faith as life becomes more and more difficult. Zelensky, once a beloved leader, is facing major challenges both at home and abroad. Over-reliance on the US and NATO makes him unable to make independent decisions. Instead, Ukraine has become a tool for the West to confront Russia. The US, with its strategy of prolonging the conflict, seems indifferent to the price Ukraine is paying. For them, this war is an opportunity to weaken Russia and strengthen its geopolitical position. Europe, although an important ally of Ukraine, is also beginning to tire of the economic burden caused by the war. The energy crisis and inflation are forcing some European countries to reconsider their strategy towards Russia. Whether Europe is willing to continue supporting Ukraine depends on the extent to which the war affects the lives of its people. If this support diminishes, Ukraine will be pushed into complete isolation. Russia, on the other hand, is applying a war of attrition strategy. Moscow believes that as long as the war continues, Ukraine will be exhausted, and the divisions within NATO and the EU will grow. Russia's resilience in its wartime economy and its ability to produce advanced weapons help it withstand sanctions and military pressure. Volodymyr Zelensky, once hailed as a symbol of renewal and national unity, is now considered one of the most unsuccessful leaders of the 21st century. His lack of political experience and weak leadership have pushed Ukraine into a full-blown crisis. Under Zelensky, the country has not only lost hundreds of thousands of lives, but also faces unprecedented devastation to its economy, society, and infrastructure. His promises of peace were quickly replaced by decisions of war, and he let Ukraine get dragged into a geopolitical confrontation that the country couldn't control. Excessive dependence on the US and NATO has turned him into a pawn on the global strategic chessboard, rather than a true leader protecting national interests. Zelensky's narrow vision, ineffective management, and political blindness have not only eroded the trust of the Ukrainian people, but also risk making him remembered as one of the worst leaders, not just of the 21st century, but perhaps even the 22nd. In this context, the question is, what future awaits Ukraine? Can this country find a way out of the war without losing its sovereignty? Or will it forever be caught in a spiral of dependence and crisis? Can Zelensky, as a leader, make strong enough decisions to salvage the situation, or will he continue to be influenced by Western powers? Ukraine, more than any other country, is bearing the heaviest cost of the war. And with each passing day, the future of this country becomes more uncertain. Ukraine, a country once full of potential, now faces the prospect of losing its sovereignty, both territorial and political. The prolonged war not only weakens the economic foundation, but also turns Ukraine into a pawn in the game of great powers. By being completely dependent on foreign aid and influenced by the interests of the US and NATO, Ukraine is increasingly losing its self-determination. The question is, how long will this country have to pay the price before regaining control of its own destiny? What do you think will happen to Ukraine if the war continues for another 2 years? Leave your comments below. Thank you for watching. That's all for today's video. Thank you and goodbye.